Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Now I see many participants are coming to this Zoom room. So I think that now the time to start. Okay, so thank you so much for all for coming back to the OECD online workshop on establishing occupational exposure limits. And this is Koki Takaki, an OECD administrator for the Working Party on Exposure Assessment. And I think some of you might come first today, so I would like to give you some introduction again. And this workshop is to present our latest report on the OEL settings and explore the further harmonized approach for the OECD settings amongst regulatory agencies. In addition, this workshop is jointly hosted by Japan NIOSH and OECD. And as a case study, we will be focused on the new legal framework in Japan. And mostly it has been done on the day one. And Japan NIOSH is offering English-Japanese interpretation to facilitate the discussion at the meeting. And wait a moment, please. Yep. Yeah, you can find an interpretation icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen. When you click the icon, you can choose the language you prefer, English or Japanese. And here the instruction. I hope you can see the screen. And next, and here the other tips for the Zoom webinar. Please see the screen. You can send your questions at any time during the talk via the Q&A function. The presenters can answer the questions via the function after the presentations. And we will also take some of them during the panel discussion session. We will use the chat function to share technical and useful information. Also note that this workshop will be recorded and the recording file will be uploaded online later. Okay, so that's all for the instruction about the Zoom webinar. And here is a little background about this project. The OECD Working Party on Exposure Assessment and Working Party on Hazard Assessment have a joint project focusing on the OEL settings among countries. The survey was conducted in 2021 and the report was published in June 2022. This workshop proposed by Japan as a follow-up of the survey to discuss generic process and workflow for setting OELs and to focus on future perspectives, that is exploring international harmonization on the OEL settings. These discussion results are to be summarized in a report to be published in hopefully Q1 2023. And on Friday, that is day one, we had a wonderful discussion about approaches to set OELs. And we have got many good suggestions and input by the expert here, as the panelists and experts of day one. And on day two, that is today, is to more focus on international harmonizations on the OEL settings. We invited various experts around the world with the highest qualities, particularly taking initiatives on the OEL harmonizations among different countries or different organizations. The first is Michelle Dubois from Health Canada, will present the potential harmonizations identified in our survey report. And the next, Yvette Selmi Mohammed will present the US initiatives for the harmonization in the OEL value settings. And Andy Mayer from Will Committee represents their initiatives amongst the non-governmental organizations like ACZIH and WHEELS. And from Germany colleagues, Claudia and Klaus will share with their the latest research project on exploring the harmonization of the OEL settings. And Lawrence from ECHA represents us as their harmonization initiatives amongst EU countries. Okay, so that's a brief introduction of the program day 2. I hope to have a fruitful discussion again for seeking further harmonized approach on OEL settings. Okay, that's the end of my presentations. So I would invite the first presenters of this session today. Yes, this is a session 2 future perspective exploring international harmonization of the OEL settings. And this session is to explore the potential to harmonize some or all approaches used to establish OELs internationally and discuss what role OECD could play to add value on that topics. So first, I would invite Michel Duveau from Health Canada, who was drafting the report and will present the survey result on the potential for international harmonization in the OEL settings described in the OECD report. Okay, so Michel, take the floor, please.
Okay, thank you, Koki. Once again, good morning from North America, and good afternoon to those of you who are in Europe, and good evening to those of you who are in Japan. So today my presentation will build upon the first presentation that I gave at the workshop day 1. And today's focus will be on the discussions of harmonization in the OECD report. So as mentioned in day 1, I'll give a bit of background for people on the next 2 slides for people who weren't able to attend day 1. The approaches and for deriving OELs and resulting OEL values can differ among different organizations. And part of that is due to an absence of a globally harmonized approach for deriving OELs. In last year, there was a survey that was sent to members of the working parties on hazard assessment and exposure assessment under OECD, and responses were received and were compiled into the report that Koki has mentioned. And I have the URL for a list of OECD reports on which the report is listed here, but there's a longer URL that I believe that OECD will be posting in the chat that will take you directly to the report. So just to summarize from last day, there are many commonalities in the OEL processes. And what we identified through the report is that at the overall high level, there are the approaches to deriving OELs are common among the organizations. So some of these high-level similarities are that the durations of OELs are the same among countries. The critical effects that are considered in the deriving of the OELs are also similar. In some cases, some endpoints will only be considered qualitatively, but they are still all considered. The literature database that is used for the basis of identification of key studies is also common between organizations. And the approach for deriving OELs for threshold toxicants by dividing a point of departure by assessment or uncertainty factors is also common among organizations. All of the countries also use hazard notations, and most commonly what we found was that the skin notation was used. However, where differences do result from organizations is typically from the specific decisions that are made in the risk assessment process that result often from specific policy decisions and different problem formulations in the different organizations. So the current status of harmonization that we identified through the surveys, there is some harmonization that is already occurring. Typically, what we were seeing is that the collaboration and coordination was occurring mostly within countries. So within Canada, within the US, and within different European countries and Japan as well. And then also within the regional level at Europe as well. But there didn't seem to be any high level international collaboration that was already occurring. Another commonality that we noticed, or another harmonization, I guess, point that we noticed as well, is that many organizations used OELs that were derived by other organizations, such as ACJH, the former SCOL and current RAC under ECHA, German MAC and DECOS as their starting points for their assessments. And so this highlights the need to make the OEL documentation and methodologies publicly available. And those organizations that did use those other OELs as starting points mentioned how it helped them because it allowed for efficient use of resources rather than starting off with a completely new OEL derivation. Some also mentioned in the survey the fact that there wasn't more harmonization was a challenge to them. So they mentioned that there was often a lack of alignment and timing specifically. And so sometimes that could cause an impact and difficulties whenever two organizations were working on the same assessments for the same chemical, but might have been done at a slightly different time. And so most of the survey respondents were very interested in additional harmonization activities. I've broken up some of the suggestions for harmonization activities into 4 different categories. So the first category is guidance. There were many organizations who were interested in a high-level international guidance on the derivation of OELs. Within that documentation, there were also some suggestions of points for discussion. So that included looking at confidence assessments and ways of addressing uncertainty and variability. When and how to deviate from default approaches and values. Some acceptable levels of risk, particularly for carcinogens. And identifying some criteria as well on when OELs should and how they should vary from the exposure guidelines that were developed for the general population. As well, the next category is information sharing. So organizations were interested in the sharing of the timing of assessments and of work plans as well to help address some issues with alignment of different or the same assessments going on at slightly different times. There was also interest in sharing of new studies, particularly if they were have the potential to affect existing OELs or new or identify the need for new OELs. There was also some interest in sharing of documentation for the OEL derivation. And also an interest in looking at sharing information on new risk assessment methodologies, particularly how they could be incorporated into the OEL development process. The third category was work sharing. So there was interest in sharing the prioritization processes, particularly for aspects that would be common among the organizations. So for example, the hazard aspects of the hazard screening aspects of prioritization could be common among organizations, even if their exposure aspects are different. There was also interest in sharing the work for evaluating scientific literature. So having different organizations break up the work and then so that it wasn't all one organization who was performing the work. And also the identification of points of departure. That is something that was discussed as could be work that is shared among organizations, or that one organization is tasked with doing this work and then could share the results with other organizations. The fourth category, which was more discussed from the perspective of that it would be more difficult to do or was not necessary to do, was policy alignment. So this included, this was discussed from the perspective of deriving common OELs. And organizations were not some organizations mentioned they weren't necessarily interested in deriving a common value in the end. And that also there would be a lot of challenges in doing that because of the differences in approaches and needs from different organizations. But despite this, even without deriving common OELs in every case, and allowing for deriving of values that meet everybody's needs, there is still some potential for doing a lot of other activities from a lot of other harmonization activities that could be helpful. So some of the potential benefits of harmonization that were mentioned in the surveys are the fact that there's a reduction in duplication of efforts among organizations, which can save both time and money. And as a result, as we heard on Friday, that there are OELs only for a small number of chemicals that are in the workplace. This could benefit and contribute to increasing the number of existing OELs if there's a more efficient process, which could also allow for the updating of older, potentially outdated OELs as well. It can also allow for providing a standardized level of protection of workers, so that worker protection isn't dependent on where a worker works. And this can also benefit employers as well if the compliance requirements for organizations, for companies who have locations in multiple jurisdictions or countries have difficulties with meeting compliance in different locations. This could help as well. The information sharing as well is very important for increasing the amount of transparency in OEL derivation, which can benefit not only the organizations that are deriving OELs, but also the end users of the OELs as well, since it'll be easier for them to know how the OELs are derived and some of the inputs and weaknesses of them as well, which will help with their decision making. Some of the potential barriers to harmonization included the fact that often it's difficult to obtain either the methodologies for OEL derivation or the documentation for specific OEL derivation from different organizations. There's also some difficulties in the fact that sometimes the timing of assessments does need to be different among organizations if there are different priorities on chemicals. There's also differences in policies and approaches, as we mentioned in the first day, and this can result in different needs of different organizations. But again, there's already some degree of harmonization and coordination that is currently ongoing, and that there is also an interest in more of it. And the types of activities that were suggested are activities that could still occur with differences in organizations. So these activities could range from developing guidance and sharing information to work sharing, and then in some rare cases as well, policy alignment. And the harmonization activities, again, could be performed even though there are differences in policies and approaches and needs. So I just want to thank a whole lot of people who helped contribute to the presentation both on Friday and today in different manners. So Aya was the writer for a lot of the report, and Megan and Sarah also contributed to the writing of the report. Christine is my supervisor who oversaw a lot of the managing of the report through Health Canada. And then Tara, Sarah, and Angelica all proposed the project initially to OECD and helped to put that on the WPEA and WPHA agendas. And then from OECD, there are many members of the Secretariat as well that helped with the different parts of the report writing and making sure that that was reviewed and approved and then finally published. As well as organizing meetings and workshops. And then we'd also like to thank members of the two working parties under OECD and the OEL subgroup that was under those working parties as well for their involvement in the report. And the survey respondents, because without the survey respondents, we wouldn't have had a report. And I thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michelle, for a very good summary on the survey report, particularly on the on the section for seeking a potential harmonization among globally. And so as we did on Friday, if the audience have any questions, use the Q&A function. Unfortunately, Michelle will not attend the panel discussion. So please post your question on the Q&A box. And it's not an obligation, but Michelle can answer the question using this box. Okay, so thank you, Michelle.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And so I would invite the next speaker, and Yvette Silver Muhammad from the US EPA to share their experience of coordination and collaboration in OEL settings among the US organization, OSHA, EPA, and NIOSH, and as well as the further harmonization attempts. So, hi Yvette, morning.
Hello, good morning. Just getting my screen up here.
Okay.
Sorry, my share button is not quite there yet. My apologies.
No. Do you want us to share? Okay. Now it's coming. Yeah.
Yes, you see it now. Thank you. All right.
Okay, so please make it a presentation mode, please.
Yep. Greetings all.
Thank you. Go ahead, please.
All right. Can you see my presentation now?
Yep.
Thank you. Sorry about that delay. Greetings. I'm Yvette Selvi Mohamedou, and I'm going to discuss our U.S. coordination efforts between EPA, OSHA, and NIOSH on what we've been doing on occupational exposure limits. I will start with briefly discussing each of our statutory requirements regarding occupational exposure limits, and then go over our coordination efforts. So the USA EPA has what we call new chemical exposure limits. We call those a nickel, and it is an exposure limit that is developed to establish adequate protection to human health from airborne concentrations of our pre-manufactured substances. The nickel does not provide time-weighted duration parameters in the limits like we do for some of our other exposure limits. EPA's on our website, we actually have a table that lists out actual nickel concentrations for specific chemical substances that are regulated by TSCA. And it's specifically under our Section 5E consent orders. And as far as another exposure limit that we use is our existing chemical exposure limit. It is an 8-hour occupational inhalation exposure limit based on the point of departure of the most sensitive endpoints identified in our risk evaluation. It takes into consideration the uncertainties that are within the risk evaluation. The ECHO represents it represents the concentration at which an adult human would be unlikely to suffer adverse effects if exposed for a working lifetime, and it includes susceptible populations. EPA has stated in its memorandum for the first 10 ECHOs, and that as a matter of TSCA risk management policy, exposures below the ECHOs would eliminate the TSCA unreasonable risk presented by that chemical. And we present that, which is presented in our risk evaluations and our risk determination sections. So in addition to the ECHO, in TSCA Section 6 rules, EPA sets and what we would call an ECHO action level that triggers additional monitoring to ensure that workers are not exposed above that. And it is solely based on human health values, PODs, IURs, benchmark MOEs that have been derived in our risk evaluations, and uses default assumptions about occupational exposure scenarios. And so any uncertainties inherent to those endpoints or the dose response analysis, including our benchmark dose modeling, our uncertainty factor selection, remains applicable within our ECHO. So we are applying this ECHO to all of our COUs and occupational exposure scenarios through the use of default assumptions for the duration and frequency. And these ECHOs have been discussed in proposed rules and are being considered for rules that are currently under development. They have not been incorporated at this time as any requirements in a final TSCA Section 6 regulation yet. So going to OSHA's permissible exposure limit PELs. So the OSHA PELs, time-weighted average TWA based on an employee's average airborne exposure to any 8-hour work shift of a 40-hour work week, which shall not be exceeded. OSHA is required to promulgate a standard that reduces significant risk to the extent that it is technologically and economically feasible to do so. And OSHA recognizes that many of its PELs are outdated, and for ensuring protection of worker health, most of them were established in the 70s and based on what was technically feasible at the time. So for NIOSH, these are authoritative federal recommendations established according to the legislative mandate for NIOSH to recommend standards to OSHA. RELs are intended to limit exposure to hazardous substances in workplace air to protect worker health. In developing the RELs and the other recommendations to protect worker health, NIOSH evaluates available medical, biological, engineering, chemical, and trade information relative to the hazard. A lot of the RELs were developed in the 1990s, and so, based on what was technologically feasible at the time. So this slide really gets into what we've been doing in terms of our interaction and coordination. So we are interacting regularly. So EPA, OSHA, NIOSH are interacting regularly to consider policy and science implication for all three of the agencies. So on the policy side, as part of our interactions, we've identified environmental and workplace health and safety problems, and to effectively implement our national workplace and environmental statutes. We've been coordinating on several priority chemicals. And for example, as part of our EPA's asbestos rulemaking efforts, we are cross-referencing OSHA regulations for consideration of adopting PELs for workplace exposure limits. Other collaboration efforts include the process of creating MOUs as a means for agency to create more formal interagency interactions. And in the past, EPA and OSHA have created MOUs. We currently have one for OSHA implementation of TSCA Section 5 and sharing of confidential business information. There's some of our more recent ones. There's another one with EPA's Region 3 and OSHA's working relationship. And then there's also a couple of other MOUs. So on the science side, we have identified what we call technical points of contact to facilitate technical consultations of our analysis for priority chemicals. We bring in experts from all 3 agencies, have scheduled virtual meetings to discuss occupational monitoring data, representative sampling strategies, EPA test order development, and other pertinent information that's needed for workers. NIOSH and OSHA experts have also reviewed, provided input on documents related to the use of the cascade of impactors for our exposure monitoring that we do. And so in summary, we really just have this continued collaboration where we're meeting again where EPA, OSHA, and NIOSH are meeting regularly to address some of the and coordinate around our priority chemicals. Thank you so much for the presentation.
Thank you so much, Yvette, for a great presentation and sharing your good practice and good coordination and collaboration among the relevant organization, OSHA, NIOSH, and EPA. And thank you. So if the audience have any questions, please use the Q&A box and to post the questions, and Yvette will answer some of them. Okay, so thank you, Yvette. And then I would move to, and I would invite the next speaker, Andy Mayer, will committees to present their experience of coordination of collaboration in OEL settings among other organizations. So Andy, are you with us? Hi.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you, Koki. Let me try to share my screen.
Yes, please. Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, excellent. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for the opportunity to give a presentation today. I'll be speaking on the concept of OEL methods harmonization and perspectives from the WHEEL Committee. So the WHEEL Committee may be less familiar to some of you, so I thought I'd give a little bit of history. WHEEL stands for Workplace Environmental Exposure Levels, and our volunteer committee has been working on setting occupational exposure limits that are health-based since 1978. They actually started with the American Industrial Hygiene Association's hygienic guides and evolved into a technical working committee setting health-based OELs. In 2012, the American Industrial Hygiene Association entered into a memorandum of understanding and transitioned the management of the WHEEL Committee activity to the Occupational Alliance for Risk Science, of which I'm the manager. Now, our operations and the nature of our work is very similar to the ACGH TLV committee. We have approximately 35 members, all volunteers. Our members are primarily occupational toxicologists, health physicians, industrial hygienists. One thing I wanted to note that's a little different about the WHEEL committee is a lot of the compounds for which we set OELs are either more data poor or have less epidemiology data and less large data sets. And for that reason, what we have is a lot of occupational toxicologists and industrial hygienists on the committee, and we bring in adjunct specialty scientists to help us with special issues that arise. Examples would be a deeper look into a specific endpoint, the need for PBPK modeling expertise at a high level. So we have adjunct connections that we bring in to collaborate on some of these methodology questions. Our members are represented by diverse affiliations, regional expertise. We have members in North America and Europe. We're actually seeking to increase our membership of our technical committee with members from other parts of the world, including Asia. So if you know someone who might be interested, please reach out to me. I'll also note that actually, in addition to myself being on the WHEEL committee, Bruce Nauman, who you heard from on Friday, was a long-term member of the committee, and he actually recruited me to join this committee. And Michelle DeVoe, who you heard from this morning, is actively on the committee. So we have a lot of crossover with other technical committees. We always want to ensure we're making impacts. So here's some examples of impacts of the WHEELs. They are cited in many different other regulatory bodies as an authoritative or useful source of guidance where existing regulatory guidance does not exist. Examples would be in the TSCA program that Yvette just mentioned, and the US FDA's PMTA guidance are examples of where they refer to other external sources of information one might seek. The wheels are typically listed in those sorts of places. OSHA has guidance on chemicals with no PELs, and in their guidance, again, they refer to other consensus and authoritative standards that might be useful for users of worker health protection standards, and the wheels are noted in that context. Wheels have been used as a source of information for advancing the science of setting benchmarks for data for chemicals, like the NIOSH banding validation efforts. And importantly, the wheels are a source and recognized as a source of OELs for replacement refrigerants by ASHRAE and the ISO 817 standards and other countries as well as being cited on many SDSs. So the wheels are used by a lot of different parties as a source of guidance, particularly where where guidance is lacking from other bodies. As far as the wheel values, we have currently about 190 health-based OELs that are published. You can find the list of the wheels on the website that's listed here. In addition, because we see the value and really the importance of making sure that we have the OELs documentation is available for deep inspection, because we want our users of OELs not to have any barrier to understanding the science behind it. So in 2019, we started an initiative to actually publish as open access journal publications all the new OEL dossiers developed by the Wheel Committee. And those are published in the journal Toxicology and Industrial Health. And they get a lot of use. I think our most used OEL that's published here had, in the first 2 years of its being published, it had over 4,000 downloads. Another thing that makes the Wheel Committee a little different is the types of substances we tend to develop OELs for. So we're not typically going to develop an OEL for something that has an existing OEL. So common metals or common solvents are generally something we would not be developing OEL, because we want to make sure that we're adding to the overall coverage of OELs and not duplicating effort. So some of the types of substances for which we might have an OEL are specialty chemicals. We're increasingly publishing OELs on pharmaceuticals. In fact, we're getting ready to release OELs for some antibiotics soon. We have a series of OELs related to fluorocarbon chemistry and refrigerants that are being used as replacements. And we also have initiatives around OELs for drugs of abuse that are important for emergency services workers. So again, these are some of the examples of different types of substances that are represented and are being developed. Now, we always want to maximize our impact. So for that reason, the Wheel Committee very specifically focuses on chemicals with limited available guidance. So we're not going to go out and seek to develop a wheel if there's already existing authoritative limits by any of the organizations that we heard from on Friday or hearing from today. So for that reason, it's important for us to have a good understanding of the landscape of OELs, and we have a chemical nomination and selection process that takes that into account. So for developing a new wheel, we basically have three pathways to getting a wheel nominated and moving into the development phase. High priority based on exposure and hazard. So there's no existing OELs that we can find, but we do know that the exposure potential is high. In other words, it would be a number of different companies or users of that particular chemistry, and it has a significant hazard potential. And this is that important point that Michelle raised about understanding the landscape of who's already actively working on OELs so that we're not duplicating effort. Second is we get a lot of external nominations. A good example is we're actually working on an OEL for methamphetamine. Again, raised out of the issue of needing OEL guidance for emergency responders who respond to situations where those types of chemicals might be present. And we also have an external sponsorship program. The sponsorship program doesn't change the science process of the Wheel Committee at all, but it is a way to make sure priority needs are being met from sponsors. And so it is a prioritization and getting the committee to work on chemistry a little bit sooner. So we have an opportunity for sponsorships. And then we have a normal revision process, which would be flagged because of either awareness of new data or on a 10-year cycle. So we see our role as the wheels as filling an important data gap. So again, a lot of times you'll find wheels where there are no other published OELs, but you're still getting that same robust quality of a large consensus-based committee. So we follow 3 steps in evaluating whether we can be filling an important data gap. So one approach is to verify the current landscape. We ask ourselves, well, will our efforts add to the community of practice? And our first step is making sure we just have a good workflow to identify current assessments. And I think, again, Michelle mentioned this in her survey work about the challenge of identifying sources of all expert group OELs. To my knowledge, there's not one place to look to find all OELs. There's some very good resources. I guess this was mentioned, I think, from Friday. That's a great one. We use that for sure. But it doesn't have, for example, the wheels listed or TLVs, I don't believe. So having a good workflow to make sure you're identifying all the expert group OELs is important. And we have such a workflow that we've developed. Second is identifying if the assessment rationale is available. I think that point was also mentioned, because it's also mentioned it's important to be able to critically review the basis for OELs to evaluate whether you're going to be adding anything new if you do an assessment. And third is to review the potential added value of a wheel. And some questions we ask ourselves are, well, making sure there's no current published OEL for the chemical, verifying if existing assessment is not actively in review. So there might be an OEL, but it's not being actively reviewed. Or there might be some OELs that are policy-based, but don't have the same constituency or the same underlying or underpinning approach of developing a health-based OEL. So in some cases, we might develop an OEL if one exists under those 2 conditions. I will say that we get asked to develop OELs, and we do turn them away if there's existing authoritative OELs by other bodies. Actually, this is a figure from a paper Michelle wrote with myself and some other colleagues about understanding the differences among OELs. And again, we find this topic of harmonization really important for the Operations Wheel Committee, because again, we're always looking to see if we can add some new value to the OEL landscape, because we don't want to be duplicating efforts. So again, having a framework for evaluating existing guidance, either to determine if you should set a wheel, and also to leverage off data from other existing types of health-based exposure limits, which I think Bruce mentioned on Friday as well. So we do know that there are differences in OELs for a lot of different reasons. Some of them are policy-based, as Michelle has mentioned. So some OELs consider feasibility, either economic and technical achievability or analytical detection feasibility are 2 examples. There are also differences based on residual risk or other risk policy decisions, depending on the nature of the endpoint. Some organizations set quantitative OELs for cancer, some set other risk management-based approaches. It depends on the different type of endpoint. And organizations might differ in their policies with regard to reviews and updates. So it's important for us to recognize all those differences, again, in leveraging or using information or deciding if we can add to the overall landscape. Also, there's differences in the science methods that are applied among different organizations. So again, we look at this closely. And one thing I just wanted to note is that we do recognize that methodologies have shifted over time. In general, in my own observation, there's a convergence between occupational and environmental risk assessment, and transparency is generally increasing. So there is a positive trend in that regard. And I just noted a few examples of types of methodologies that I see emerging or changing or growing in the occupational community. You saw some examples of this on Friday. I'm sure some more today. For example, benchmark dose modeling. That's in the environmental risk assessment arena, that's usually treated as the default approach. Excuse me. So moving to default status for most government organizations. And many expert groups that set OELs, including the Wheel Committee, TLV Committee, and others, do use the benchmark dose modeling techniques, but it might be on a case-by-case or might be done in conjunction with NOEL, LOEL review to see if it's adding additional value or is it being overly precise with the existing data. So that is evolving to increase use of benchmark dose modeling and other such tools. Inhalation dosimetry adjustments, again, moving to default status for many OEL organizations. I find this one highly variable among different organizations. So this is one that definitely needs to look at closely. Partly it depends on the nature of the data sets. I'll say that it seems like most organizations for vapor and gas, since the default dosimetry adjustment, in many cases, a value of 1, whether it's applied or not applied, doesn't have too much of a numerical difference, but there are differences in taking account, for example, different breathing rates that vary among organizations. For aerosols or particles, that can be quite variable. Some folks use inhalation dosimetry models and others don't. So again, we always look at that very closely when we're looking at other organizations' evaluations. Most organizations do try to maximize the use of toxicokinetic data for route extrapolation. Again, acknowledging there are default approaches that exist, but of course we look at that closely as well. And linear dose extrapolation, most, again, very positive developments. Most organizations have as an initial step evaluation of the mode of action as a determination as to understanding the appropriate dose response approaches to use. Again, some use a default linear extrapolation approach for direct genotoxicants. Others use that information and mode of action to inform a weight of evidence approach that might include consideration of a linear extrapolation range, which is actually the methodology that the WHEEL committee uses. So overall, we track very closely the different harmonization, growth, and convergence of methodologies. The WHEEL committee, again, operates in a very similar mode to, for example, the TOV committee. And as Michelle said, the underpinnings of OEL development science are very similar across organizations. So we use the same kind of systematic review principles for making sure we identify information in a comprehensive way, hazard characterization approaches to identify relevant endpoints that might be targets for consideration, points of departure assessment, whether they're NOELs, low-ELs, or benchmark doses, application of assessment factors, and then assignment of notations as appropriate. So all those things are common. But again, we do really appreciate the value of harmonization, which, according to, the definitions of such as shared understanding, but not necessarily requiring standardization. So again, it goes to this idea of transparency and sharing. And since methodologies can differ for a lot of many good reasons, including problem formulation reasons and policy reasons, it's just important to recognize the importance of transparency. Now, for the WHEEL committee, one of the things we really considered in sort of documenting our science methods was a balance between allowing for science judgment and providing resources on the tools that one might use versus being very prescriptive. So we lean more into the providing general frameworks and sets of tools and precedent, but not being too prescriptive because each chemical has its own unique issues and considerations. So in that light, we've developed science operating procedures. And again, the methods continue to evolve. So the biggest thing is staying fluent in these methods. We do have these available for external parties if requested. We're developing practice guidance to increase consistency and transparency actually among the WHEEL committee members, because again, having 35 members and small author teams peer reviewed by the whole committee, we want to make sure we're consistent within our own internal practice as well. So these are some examples of different operating procedures that we've developed. A cancer approach for evaluating point of departure using modeling, assessment factors, our approach for sensitization notations. And what I want to mention is that's really evolving and we're finding more useful for the WHEELs because they're often data poor chemicals or less data rich, is the possibility of using read across. So just a couple examples in my last few remaining couple minutes here. So with regard to the cancer endpoint, again, we consider the cancer endpoint along with non-cancer directly in setting a WHEEL value. And that's because we know that, in practice, IH professionals need some kind of risk value guidance that they can use to help them develop their risk management strategies at the site or facility level. So we do incorporate cancer and non-cancer together in the final WHEEL derivation and make sure just protective of both. The process includes a mode of action review as an underpinning. If there are indications of genotoxicity and we have carcinogenicity data, then we'll do a benchmark dose approach. But what we do with that benchmark dose is apply either assessment factors or linear extrapolation or both, depending on the mode of action. And then we'll make a final assessment based on the weight of evidence. In a recent example, that's a document that's actually going out for public review soon, is Piccolines, where the wheel is actually based on lung tumors in female rats from an oral study. We had a benchmark dose model was conducted. We did dosimetry and with linear extrapolation. That actually was not that far off from the wheel we would have derived from non-cancer effects. And it has a proposed wheel of 0.3 ppm, time weighted average with a skin notation. With regard to points of departure selection and modeling, we use all, we try to use all the best available science and tools that we have. So again, we do usually assess traditional NOELs and LOELs. And if we think benchmark dose modeling will provide added value, then we will use that. Usually that is in the case when we have poor dose spacing in the critical studies, LOEL only, so the lowest dose showed adverse effects, or for tumor endpoints. And then we'll also apply point of departure adjustments using dosimetry tools. So inhalation dosimetry, we generally, unless we have some specific knowledge about the chemical that differs from this, the default will be 1 for gas phase chemicals, and that's consistent with most guidance around the world these days. For aerosols, we are increasingly using tools like multi-part pathway particle dosimetry model and other similar types of tools, extrapolating for deposited dose in the region of the respiratory tract of interest. And if we have PBPK models, we will use those as well. An example would be for N-methylpyrrolidone wheel that causes developmental toxicity in rats by both oral and inhalation routes. There's been several actually PBPK models developed for NMP, so we actually evaluated those closely and used a weight of evidence from 3 different models. We also developed a STEL or short-term exposure limit to address potential irritation as identified from a human controlled exposure study. And the wheel was, final wheel derived was 20 ppm time weighted average with a skin notation and 30 ppm STEL. With regard to assessment factors, again, very similar to what most organizations do. Bruce Nauman on his talk on Friday mentioned this paper by Dave Dankovic with our colleagues at NIOSH and others. So we use the same traditional line of thinking for uncertainty or assessment factors. But we don't have a default factor. So we don't set, it's always 10 unless we have some data to move away from defaults. It's more of a weight of evidence, but I will say that our authors come from, this is a volunteer job for them. So they have day jobs, and in their day jobs, they might have different roles or perspectives. So they're very familiar with all the range of typical defaults among organizations and bring that thinking to bear. At the end of the day, a composite factor is derived and key uncertainties are described in the rationale for the wheel. And you can calculate basically the composite factor from the wheel rationale directly, but we don't list out individual factors. And that's really reflects the idea that it gives us flexibility in the final derivation where we can integrate different lines of evidence and come up with a cohesive, what we think is the most reasonable wheel value. Last point I wanted to make is we do a lot of read across approaches. We actually take advantage of the OECD's framework and use a lot of tools that are available in the public domain that are listed here. And this just lists some examples where we have done a lot of different wheels where we have used read across either for gap filling to answer a mode of action question, or if we have deep mechanistic understanding, even to develop relative potencies among different class of compounds. So last but not least, our outreach and education activities. We do see the value of further outreach and education, recognizing the need for more OELs. We want to cover the landscape of OELs more broadly, which is a role we think we are seeking to play. Part of that increases awareness of OEL, so we do teach courses at different events like the American Industrial Hygiene Conference and Exposition. We have a program for mentoring to bring in students and young early investigators to mentor or work alongside our wheel committee members. And we're, of course, always keeping pace with new science. In fact, actually, last week, I was at a New Approach Methodologies conference talking about the importance of those sort of techniques for setting OELs. I want to thank everybody for the opportunity to present today. Hopefully, learn a little bit about the wheel committee And if you have any questions or any follow-ups, just feel free to reach out to me. My email is listed here. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andy, for your great presentation. And yeah, that's super interesting that you provided many instruction in seeking about a more harmonized approach in OEL settings. To some example you provided about we may provide further guidance, practical guidance on the specific endpoint, and also you could identify the what caused the differences between the organizations. That's a very good example. Thank you so much, Andy. And if you have any questions, please post your question on the Q&A box, and Andy may answer some of them. Okay, just to remind you. Okay, so I would like to invite the next speakers. Next speakers is from German colleagues, and Claudio Dorser from Bauer, and Klaus Schneider for Big Germany to present their research result on OEL derivations for airborne chemicals, which is focused on the comparison of method and protection levels. So
Yeah.
who starts? Hi, Claudia.
I start. Hi. Thank you, Koki, and hello to everybody. We appreciate the opportunity to present the results of our project today, and I will briefly explain why we started a project on OEL methods and protection levels, and then I will give the floor to Klaus Schneider. So let's first take a look at the variety of exposure limits for the workplace. There exist various values, and health-based guidance values for the workplace are not only established in the context of occupational safety and health legislation, but also in other regulatory areas, for example, DNELs under the EU chemicals legislation REACH. And in general, exposure limit values can differ in several aspects, for example, the level on which they apply, the legal status, the origin, and the definition. So there are health-based and regulatory adjusted values. The latter means values that involve considerations of technical or economic feasibility. And our research project focused on health-based values only, and it focused on threshold-based values. The Bauer is a research institution of the federal government, and the project arose from Bauer's involvement in different regulatory frameworks and the fact that different committees or regulations may come to different exposure limit values for the workplace for the same substance. So on the EU level, the harmonization of airborne exposure limit values was a current issue at the beginning of the project some years ago. And in particular, differences observed between DNELs and OELs have generated discussion. And one reason for differences between values is the use of different default values for extrapolation factors. That is the default values, for example, for time, interspecies, and intraspecies extrapolation. And it is not practicable that exposure limit values for the same substance differ, but the European committees involved at that time, SCOL and RAC, have not been able to agree on a limit value for individual substances. And therefore, the European Commission saw a need for action to advance the harmonization of limit values. And as a step in this direction, we thought it at first to be important to create an up-to-date databases. So Bauer has already carried out projects on extrapolation factors in the late 1990s. The results have been incorporated into the criteria for deriving OELs in Germany. However, the databases is about 20 years old and an update was desirable. And so this project aimed to update and to improve the empirical database for extrapolation, thus preparing the scientific basis. And by this, the project wants to contribute to transparency of the approaches and their protection levels, as well as the common understanding in the OEL community of the necessary specifications. The overall aim is to contribute to harmonization of the approaches for deriving OELs in various regulatory areas of the European Union. And by communicating the results, we want to take the OEL community on board, as steps towards harmonization can only be taken as a joint effort. In this sense, the comprehensive research report, as well as supplementary material on the data analysis, is provided on the Bauer website. 2 scientific articles are freely available. And in addition, an international workshop took place in Dortmund at Bauer and online in April. And the slides and a written summary on this workshop are also accessible on the Bauer website. Part of the project presented today is based on work packages that described the status quo of various aspects of limit derivation, in particular the methods currently used by the committees and regulations and their default values for extrapolation factors. The other building block for the results are new data analysis of various data sources from which distributions of extrapolation factors were derived. Finally, the distributions established were used in a probabilistic approach, which made it possible to discuss the different protection levels that are provided in the different frameworks. And having said this, I hand over to Klaus Schneider from VOBIC. He led the project at VOBIC and carried out the analysis with his team. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia.
No, Klaus, please go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you for paving the way, Claudia. As said, I will now, with the following slides, present some of the results from this project. And we started with part one, analyzing these existing frameworks and their methodologies by noticing that actually these values share a common definition, meaning that they aim to protect workers from adverse health effects. But there are differences, sorry, there are differences in methodology, there are differences in the data used for deriving the OELs, and therefore we might assume that there are also differences in numerical values of OELs. And when we looked into the details of the methodologies, we actually saw that differences are occurring at virtually every step of the derivation process, which is data gathering, data documentation, then identifying key studies, key endpoints, and the point of departure, adapting for differences in exposure scenarios, using assessment factors, and so on. And we saw especially large differences in some of these areas, and most prominently among them, the size of the assessment factors used, the use or non-use of the benchmark dose approach for deriving a point of departure, application or non-application of allometric scaling for interspecies extrapolation, and also how local effects in the respiratory tract were assessed by the various bodies. This session. So in our reports, we also show some examples for substances which underwent such a derivation process with different numerical outcomes. The second part of the project was to improve the database for extrapolation steps. Before explaining this, I would like to give some explanations on terms used. So we are talking here about assessment factors, and these are sometimes also called uncertainty factors, but uncertainty actually is about the unknown. But for these extrapolations, we do know quite a lot, and this information comes from the experiences we made with studies on existing chemicals. So we can, for example, compare NOELs from chronic studies with NOELs obtained from subacute studies on the same substance in the same test system. And we might see then on average, there is a factor of 5 which is required to account for that. And we can use such a factor. But there's also substance to substance variability. And we actually don't know whether our substance under evaluation behaves like the average chemical, or whether we would rather need a higher factor representing, let's say, 90% of the substances investigated. So this uncertainty can be described by probability functions, and I will show you in a minute how this might look like. And with intraspecies extrapolation, there comes a further dimension into that. And this is inter-individual variability. So this is a real biologically founded variability and susceptibility between individuals. And this is not uncertainty. But when we are exploring this with existing data, then again, also substance to substance variation, meaning uncertainty, is to be considered. I will spend some time of my slides to that point. So in that part, we investigated empirical data to learn more about time and interspecies extrapolation. So we compared the results from experimental studies. We evaluated these data and we derived distributions. I will show you an example. And for intraspecies extrapolation, we looked into human data and also tried to derive distributions describing that behavior. In this slide, you see one example, and this is interspecies extrapolation. We found that our data fitted perfectly to the concept of allometric scaling. Allometric scaling is a concept describing regular differences in susceptibility between species according to their body size or body weight. And this is only when you express doses as amount of substance per kilogram body weight. And you can correct for these regular differences by applying allometric scaling factors. And these are then species specific. And when you do so, the remaining differences can be expressed by such a distribution function here. And you see that on average, actually, the differences between humans and experimental animals then is 1, meaning that there is on average no difference in susceptibility. But if you are not happy with, let's say, be on the safe side in 50% of the substances or 50% of cases, you might wish to apply a higher factor. And for example, the factor recommended in the ECHA guidance for deriving DNLs under reach, which is 2.5, would account for 88% of that cases. Let's go to intraspecies extrapolation. We observed in the first part of the project that there are large differences in the factors used. And this is actually due to the fact that there is very limited data on inter-individual human variability. And therefore, we search for toxicokinetic studies and pharmacokinetic studies to learn more about the variability observed in these studies. And exploiting this information, we derived a distribution describing that. And for the toxicodynamic part, which is differences in susceptibility of the target organ, we used in vitro data published by Abdo and colleagues on a large set of chemicals investigated in more than 1,000 human cell lines representing various populations. And again, we derived a distribution describing this. And we combined the two by probabilistic methods to come up with one specific distribution describing the uncertainty in intraspecies extrapolation. And this is such a function derived. And one important thing is that at this level, you have to define how many of the target population of works you would actually like to include here. So this function has been derived for covering the distance between the average susceptibility and the susceptibility expressed by the 95th percentile of the population. You can also choose 99%, which we also did in our projects, or a lower percentage. And when you then compare this distribution with the currently used factors, then you see that these actually produce a broad range of probabilities. So easy talk for deriving d-nulls under reach propose a factor of 3, which represent approximately 30% of probability. And the factor of 10 used for biocides and pesticides in Europe is actually representing a high probability of around 95%. But if you do the same thing and use the same factors and compare it with a distribution for 99% of the population, then you will see that the probability achieved is lower. So you need to define at that stage what the coverage of your OEL derivation should be. And you would also need to define the probability or the remaining uncertainty. In the last part of our project, we then try to analyze the protection goals or the protection levels achieved by the various frameworks and methodologies we investigated. In the center of this slide, you see the equation you are familiar with for deriving an OEL. The POD is divided by the assessment factors to yield an OEL volume. And you can do exactly the same thing while expressing all these input parameters as distributions. For combining distributions, you would need to use probabilistic methods, but this can easily be achieved by Monte Carlo analysis methods, which are freely available. What you see in this slide here is the outcome of such an exercise. We combined all the distributions derived by such techniques, and this is the red curve here in this graph, and we compared this with the overall assessment factors proposed by the various frameworks. And this example is for a point of departure derived from a subacute inhalation study in rats, where local effects in the respiratory tract have been observed. And this is for covering 95% of the target population. And you see that these various methodologies yield in very different probabilities of achieving the level of protection aimed at. So for EasyTalk, for example, the proposed combined factor in such a case would be 3, and this is much lower than, for example, as the combined factor of 75 on the REACH or the 150 used for bioscience. And not surprisingly, this means that actually OELs might
Hi, Klaus, are you here?
when you use these methodologies. We would need to define the protection level, which means that we need to define the coverage, the percentage of the target population we are aiming to protect, as well as the remaining uncertainty or the probability of our values derived. In our project, we did that by using probabilistic methods, so this worked fine to do that. I did not dwell on uncertainties of the POD, but this input value, of course, is also related to some uncertainty. It can be described by using benchmark dose approaches, and you can describe the uncertainty associated with the POD, in that case also by such a distribution. So this is in our reports, but I didn't explain this here in detail. But we see this actually as a further advantage of the benchmark dose approach compared to using, for example, an OEL as a POD. So my last slide here, or actually second last, is looking into the future. So do we want to harmonize? In the EU, there is a clear statement by the Commission to go for the principle of one substance, one assessment over various regulatory areas. Still, there might be some features which do not need to be harmonized because they serve specific purposes. So, for example, for biocides, the derived value is expressed as an absorbed systemic dose and not as an inhalation concentration. But there are many areas where harmonization is possible and where transparency and the common understanding would benefit from looking into. And as I said, one of the key requirements from our perspective is to explain what protection goal is actually aimed at by defining coverage and probability. For harmonization, we should discuss the empirical databases to inform extrapolation steps and assessment factors. And there are many methodological steps which are performed currently in slightly or largely different ways. And we should discuss how we can harmonize this. And last not least, in order to increase transparency, all this should be explained in detailed guidance so that everybody can understand how these values have been derived. So with thanking all the colleagues involved in that project and by thanking you for your attention, I would like to close my talk. Of course, I'm happy to get your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Klaus and Claudia, for sharing a great achievement from your study in comparison of the method and OEL derivations. Thank you, and good suggestion for our future possible activity on seeking a future harmonization. Okay, so for the audience, please use the Q&A function to post on your question to Claudia and Klaus for the presentations. And it's not obligation for the presenters, but please do answer the questions as much as possible for you. Okay, so I would invite the next speaker, Lawrence Hofstadt. Hello. Yeah, hello from the ECHA, and to share the experience and establishing OEL in the EU levels and their relevant activities. So please go ahead, Lawrence.
Yes, I hope you can see my slides. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for this invitation to present how OELs are set up in the EU. Indeed, Lawrence Hofstadt, and I've been leading the OEL team at ECHA since middle of this year, actually. I'll start with an introduction on the agency and our activity and on the legislative process, and then I'll focus my presentation on the scientific steps we indeed follow at ECHA to derive OELs. So our agency, as most of you probably know, is located in Helsinki. We have colleagues from different countries in Europe, and we are responsible mainly for implementing EU chemicals regulations. So here you have the representation. We underreach companies producing or importing substances in the EU at more than 1 ton per year, must register them. And now we have a database of over 20,000 substances used in the EU. Under CLP regulation, companies must ensure that they classify, label, and package their substances or products according to the EU rules to ensure safety of consumers. Under BPR, we make sure that only approved substances and products are available on the EU market for consumers. And for the PIC regulation, so prior informed consent regulation, we ensure that we have an overview on the imports into and the exports from the EU of dangerous chemicals. And next to these regulations, we over the year have taken over on several other tasks. So some of them are listed here. For example, for poison centers, we support the national poison centers by providing a central platform which companies use to inform authorities on the safe use of their chemicals. We also propose another example, substances as persistent organic pollutants to control their risks. More recently, we've taken up a task under the EU Drinking Water Directive to collect a list of chemicals that can be used in contact with water, drinking water. And finally, we propose exposure limits to protect workers from harmful chemicals. And this is the purpose of my presentation today. So in Europe, we have the Occupational Safety and Health Framework Directive, which lays out the main principles of worker protection from the risk posed by dangerous substances at the workplace. It encompasses several directives, the Chemical Agents Directive, the Carcinogens, Mutagens, and Reproductive Substances Directive, and also the Directive on Protection of Workers from risk related to exposure to asbestos at work. It also defines that OELs are set up at EU and national levels by regulatory authorities. And it helps employers protect workers, as you all know, from the risk of being exposed to those chemicals. So in the EU, OSH also defines that OELs can be either indicative or binding. Still, both rely on the scientific assessment. In the case of indicative OELs, they are adopted directly by the European Commission, while the binding OELs are adopted through a series of steps, starting from the opinion from ECHA's Risk Assessment Committee. Based on this opinion, the Commission adopts a legislative proposal, which is also discussed with member state authorities and social partners. And this proposal is sent to the Council and European Parliament for final adoption. So I will now describe a bit more the steps actually of this, what we call ordinary legislative procedure, which applies to the binding OEL. So there are 7 steps, and as we were discussing on Friday, they rely on both a scientific assessment and a socioeconomic impact assessment, relying also on feasibility, economic consideration, and together with consultation with the authorities and social partners. So first, the Directorate General for Employment establishes the list of priorities based on several priority criteria. Then in the second steps, it requests ECHA to provide a scientific recommendation. So either an exposure risk relationship for non-threshold carcinogens or a mode of action based thresholds. And I'll explain a bit more the procedure at ECHA in a minute. As the third step, based on this scientific opinion, the working party on chemicals, which includes interest groups from workers, employers, and EU governments, prepares an agreed suggestion for an OEL value, which is then integrated into a draft opinion for adoption by the plenary of the Advisory Committee on Safety and Health. And then DG Employment drafts an impact assessment containing policy options and associated impacts, which is discussed further and submitted to the Regulatory Scrutiny Board. Upon the positive reply from the Regulatory Scrutiny Board, then DG Employment drafts a legislative proposal and submits it further to the College of Commissioners, which adopts the proposal and sends it to the Council and Parliament for negotiation and subsequent adoption as a directive. And the adopted directive is then published in the official journal, listing in its annex the new binding OEL. And the date of publication also is linked to a date by which all EU member states must transpose in their legal text the new limits and have to start enforcing them. So this was more for the policy-related process. Now more details on our procedures at ECHA that we developed since 2019. So after the request, so step one from the previous graphs, ECHA usually develops the RAC opinion within 12 to 14 months, and it has several steps. First, we start by collecting information, both internally, but also making a call for evidence to collect any additional literature information or other evidence. And both these sources support us to prepare our ECHA draft scientific report. Once this report is, the first draft is ready, we launch a public consultation for 60 days. And so that is for the transparency and information to the outside world, while we also start discussing with the rapporteur appointed by the RAC. At the end of the 60 days, we may amend our report based on the comments or any information we've received during the consultation, and we inform thereof the RAC rapporteur, who can then also finalize his or her opinion and to prepare for the RAC meeting. In general, an opinion is discussed in 2 plenary meetings by the RAC members, and in between the 2 meetings, the RAC members have an opportunity to further comment on the RAC opinion, so that in the second meeting, the opinion can be adopted. At that point, upon adoption, we finalize the documents, and ECHA sends the final RAC opinion to DG Employment, and at the same time, we publish it on our website. And from then on, the next steps in the OEL setting, regulatory OEL setting, can happen. So this is a snapshot of our website, where for all substances which we have started or completed an evaluation, you can see the status. And there are 3 main status: whether we are preparing the dossiers, so meaning the reports, and to the opinion development, or when the RAC has adopted the decision, then it's mentioned as opinion adopted. So this is for the transparency or more communication and keeping our stakeholders aware of our activity. So now, in terms of what the scientific reports contain, I think it's probably from the previous presentations quite known, but I'm still going to go through. So our reports contain, of course, information on the substance identity and its physical chemical properties. We also provide an overview of the regulatory contexts in the EU, looking at the legislation, the status and the REACH, CLP, BPR, also the plant protection product where applicable, or any other legislations. We also list all existing OELs in the EU, but also outside of the EU. We check the uses and whether the general population or part of it may be exposed to that substance. We look at the exposures during the manufacturing process or any others, and assess whether the control measures are sufficient and efficient. And finally, we collect information on the methodologies to monitor such exposures, so in the air, but also in other biological samples, and whether biomarkers of exposure can be identified by such methodologies. And of course, there is also the scientific evaluation. So from all the information collected, but also from the information on registered substances, we start assessing the point of departures. We also use information from the national and international reviews, as was previously mentioned. And we use information possibly also from previous RAC opinions, for example, adopted during the restriction process. As we already mentioned also, the health effects can be based on human data or animal data. And of course, we assess the quality, the relevance and reliability of this data. And we go through all endpoints from acute to repeated dose toxicity to irritancy and sensitization, genotoxin, carcinogenicity, and also reproductive and developmental toxicity. And during this process, we identify the mode of actions or modes of action of the substance and whether there is a threshold. So indeed, we identify several or the relevant point of departures, and we subsequently are able to derive the OEL using the relevant assessment factors. And we express it in 8-hour time-weighted average. When the substance is or may be considered as a non-threshold carcinogen, and consequently the health-based OEL cannot be recommended, we derive instead an exposure-risk relationship to support the setting of regulatory standards. And finally, we also consider whether some other limit values should be defined in our report. So short-term exposure limit values, biological limit value, biological guidance value for the general population exposure considerations, and also the notations. So indeed, in the EU, we consider skin notation, sensitization notation, or noise notation. Our methodology is described in an appendix to our ECHA guidance, which we published in August 2019. And to also conclude, we have many assessments rely on deriving OEL threshold based on the mode of actions of the substance, and we are following also some principles and criteria, similar principles and criteria regarding genotoxic carcinogens. Usually they are not considered to have a threshold because they can act through multiple modes of action. Some of them may contain key steps with threshold, but identifying them is one thing. Determining the actual threshold can be quite challenging. So only when the data is sufficient, we attempt to follow the threshold approach to determine an OEL. However, most of the case, where data is insufficient, the non-threshold approach is always taken. In this case, we also attempt that the remaining cancer risk should be, or recommend that the remaining cancer risk should be negligible. And overall, in all our assessments and steps in preparing the ECHA recommendation, we aim at remaining transparent in the way we apply the assessment factors, and also in clearly identify when the remaining uncertainty, where the remaining uncertainty lie. And this is indeed to support the subsequent legislative and policy process. So with that, I conclude my presentation, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Lawrence, for your great presentation and sharing a very comprehensive overview of your OEL setting process. Okay, so now it's time to have a short break, a coffee break. And so, and also if you have any question to Lawrence, please use the Q&A box, and we will have a coffee break, and please come back at 10 to 14 Central Europe time, 10 to 14, 13:50. It's for Japanese audience, it's 10 to 9 p.m. I think. So let us take a coffee and come back at that time. Thank you. Hello everyone, now it's time to restart and thank you for coming back to the workshop. Now we would like to move on to this next item, item 15, panel discussion. Yeah, we have received those many inputs from the speakers on the good practice on exploring the harmonization among the different organizations and countries. Now we would discuss further about this topic, inviting the 6 panelists, 5 speakers today, plus and Andrea Hartwig from Karlsruhe Institute of Technologies, the presenter on Fridays, and with the chair of the MAC commissions and also the member of the RAC committee. Now, so everyone, are you ready? Or please turn on your videos for all the panelists, please. Hi, Klaus, and yeah, Claudia, and Andy, Yvette, Andrea, and Lawrence. I hope you're here. Yes, thanks. So, yeah, as you know, we have prepared 3 questions in advance, and I hope that you all provide a good suggestions and instruction about these questions. And I would like to take the question 1, discussion topic 1, about seeking further harmonizations. The one is, are there any specific endpoints or procedures for establishing OEL that may be more amendable to international harmonizations? So I'd like to raise this topic first, and I'd like to ask you to share your opinion regarding this topic. So who can start? Okay, so Klaus, please. Thank you for the first hand.
Thank you, Cookie. If procedures actually mean part of the methodology for deriving OELs, I think the presentation of the survey by Michelle and also our project made clear that there is room for harmonization at virtually every step. So entering a discussion how we want to do it, although there's a broad experience at many committees, would still be necessary to agree on a harmonized procedure. Specific endpoints, I'm not so sure what's actually meant here. If it's toxicological endpoints, then I would say that there have been attempts to look specifically to, for example, reproductive toxicity, whether this needs different procedures compared to other endpoints. But this would be, let's say, rather from my perspective, not the highest priority. Rather, we should first go for a common understanding of the principal procedures and then do, let's say, the more specific items afterwards.
Sorry, I muted myself. Sorry, thank you, Klaus. And Andy, the next, please.
Yeah, I echo those sentiments. I made a point in my presentation that I am seeing some convergence of methodology acceptance among groups, and two that I think are just becoming more standardized as a default starting approach would be, again, the use of benchmark dose modeling as a tool that's being converged among different groups, and dosimetry approaches are also growing together. I think we're still, and I think the wonderful presentation that was given earlier highlights quite a bit of dichotomy and different approaches for assessment factors. So that's an opportunity there. With regard to methodology, I also agree that in endpoints, I agree with the idea of focusing on methodology first. Then ultimately that will yield us to closer end outcomes if we're more aligned on methodology. With regard to some toxicological endpoints, there are examples. For example, sensitization, dermal sensitization. OECD has been a lead and helping develop harmonized approaches for toxicity assessment for some certain endpoints. So I think that there is room to grow there as well, developmental and some others. But so that I think we're actually headed in the right direction. But there's certainly work to go, but at the end of the day, there will always be some differences, just as Michelle had mentioned, because of policy and other stakeholder needs.
Yeah, thank you, Andy, and thank you. So yes, I remember that you provided many examples on the future, future topics on addressing the further harmonization on some specific topics, some specific endpoints. Thank you so much. And so Claudia, please take the floor.
Thank you. Yes, I would also like to underline that I think harmonization is possible on the level of methods to derive the health-based OELs. And as Klaus Schneider showed, we prepared a new database for the assessment factors. And I think this could be a good start for harmonization, because you can harmonize the way you get you bridge data gaps. And in the case you don't have the substance-specific data. And I think Andy Meyer had a slide that faced scientific judgment versus prescriptive guidelines or something like that. And I thought about it. I would not see it as a contradiction, because you should use the guidelines in case, or the default values in case you don't have substance-specific data. And in this case, the scientific judgment is already incorporated in the guideline, because you use the best data available for bridging the data gaps. And another point would be, I think, it's already mentioned, that one could promote more the use of benchmark modeling instead of using the NOEL or LOEL, because it's the state of the art, but it's not used in the default case. Yeah, that's it for the first. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Claudia. Yes, thank you. And also in your presentation, thank you for your sharing the great preceding example of this addressing this topic. And yes, so any others to share your opinion about this? And Andrea, please.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would like to emphasize what I think I said on Friday already, that you really should have a procedure for health-based values and clearly distinguish those from impact assessment. I think this is very important, because otherwise you mix up two different things. And for the health-based values, I think really a very good documentation would be required. So everybody who establishes OEL should have a procedure which is published and which is followed. So you can really see if there are differences between OELs, where do they come from and what origin do they have. And yeah, I would like also to emphasize what has been said already, that we really take science-based assessment factors and don't call them uncertainty, or really differentiate. There may be still some uncertainties which you have to bridge by uncertainty factors, but they are different than extrapolation, science-based extrapolation factors. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Yeah, I really acknowledge that the importance of using the term assessment factors instead of the uncertainty factors. Thank you for your instruction, and also the highlighting the differentiation between the health-based value and impact assessment. Yeah, thanks. Lawrence, please.
Yes, maybe on a practical aspect also, what I've noticed between what we said Friday and today, there are at international level differences in terms of which endpoints are taken into account. So in Europe, we consider reproductive toxicity and carcinogenicity as a real priority. So if it's not considered as high priority, not priority, I shouldn't use that word, but as part of the assessments to define the OELs versus the target organ toxicity, for example, then that could be something that could be discussed. And also because, for example, we don't have in the EU notations for carcinogenicity, like there may be in other part of the world. So that would be, and also maybe in terms of methodologies, the use of modeling or QSAR data or other type of, we also don't, we rely on actual, well, I'm not saying it's not actual, but we rely on human data and animal data mostly. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lawrence, for highlighting some specific endpoints and also as well as methodologies. Yeah, thank you. And Andrea, yeah, again, please, thank you.
Yeah, maybe in addition to this, with respect to carcinogenicity, it's very important to define the mode of action. So to not only take modeling data and human and animal data, but also mechanistic data. So you can decide whether to derive at the risk estimates or the true OELs for carcinogens as well. So this would be important, but also, of course, for other substances. So take into account mechanistic data and mode of action.
Yeah, thank you so much for highlighting the importance of the derivation of the OEL for carcinogenicity. And okay, so any others? And today we have the panelists on the day one. I could see Paul Delio and Robert Pasnacassel, and yeah, some of them attended also. So if you would like to make an intervention, please feel free to raise your hand and then join the discussion. Also, you can do it. And any other ideas for this topic? Okay, if okay, so Andy, please.
Thank you so much. It may be covered in a separate question, so I didn't raise it before, but I'll raise it at least initially now. Is one thing I think would be very helpful is, and organizations like OECD are very important in this way, is basically collating or combining and making easily accessible OEL values and documentations, because it is challenging, especially for more novel OEL users, to find the whole array of different OELs. And I'd like for the panel to weigh in if they have a moment, is I'm not aware of any single source that has all expert group based OELs in one place, but there may be something, but I'm not aware of that.
Thank you, Andy, and for mentioning the possible contribution from the OECD. Thank you. And Klaus, please.
I remember a question in the chat or in the questions section on Michelle's presentation today, and the question was: are there really people, authorities not really wanting to go for harmonization? I think the question is not so easy actually, because harmonization really needs us to go into the very details of how we are doing things. So first thing would be to make everything transparent, and then secondly to agree on a procedure. And this of course might also be seen by some as sort of restrictions of how we are doing things. And Andy clearly said that every substance is different, and this might give us not enough room to react specifically to a challenge posed by one substance. I would like to comment on that I don't think that having a detailed methodology would really make expertise unnecessary. Quite to the contrary, there will be a lot of areas where unavoidably there might be different opinions and there might be expert judgment required to go one step forward. So addressing adversity of effects, for example, will always be, let's say, a case-by-case decision, taking very careful into account whatever we know about what happens with the substance and so on. So there are several sides to that discussion, and I can understand also that harmonization is considered as a real challenge.
Yeah, thank you, Klaus. I agree. Yes, I think it's impossible to set a fully harmonized approach among countries. Maybe something we need to leave as it is, yeah, reflecting their own country situations. But I also believe that in some areas, in some topics, we could address further harmonizations. And yeah, that's a good discussion point we should explore further. Okay, Andrea, please.
Well, I agree with the previous comment, but I think it's very important to be transparent. So first, I agree really that we need experts because, well, even if you put up some default factors, it's very important to explain any deviation from default factors. For example, if we have data-rich substances, why do we take them and why? And at which point don't we take them, or what's required for information or data quality and so on. So there may be different outcomes, but I think it's very important to really, well, to document all the reasons what you take. For example, whether you need a time extrapolation factor or not, or what data are required to skip this factor and so on. And as we saw in the talk, many committees have a wide variety of different factors which are taken. So it needs to be very transparent on how to proceed. And if we reach common OELs, I don't know, probably not, but at least it has to be transparent to see where the differences are and where they come from. And I think this would be important. Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. It's a very good point. I think that the keeping transparency would be really important to know why the value differs or how to proceed further with the harmonizations. Okay, thanks. So Robert, thank you for coming today as well. Robert was a panelist on the first day from the SECO Switzerland.
Yes, thank you, Koki, and thanks to all the panelists. Just to support what was previously said, I think with the ECHA guidance document, there's already a kind of harmonization included at the time being set between EU member states. So, and it will be quite challenging for updating it all together without being involved in the process. I know this from the experience also from technical guidance document from environmental quality standard, that it can be a long-lasting process, but the benefit for having a more common protection level is quite large. So I'm thinking also from the experience with the occupational biomonitoring guidance, that an effort to make a common approach on methods would also lead to more guided expert judgment, maybe also an agreement which endpoints, point of departures can be included and will automatically lead to update opportunities both on EU and national levels, and this will provide in the long run or mid-term perspective also solutions for having a more narrowed range of different OELs for protecting the workers. So I think it can be scary to have harmonization, and it needs maybe time, but the benefits would protect also in an active worker field would reach many persons.
Thank you, Robert, for addressing the benefit of the addressing harmonization among countries and also sharing the our different project report, and we addressed about the possible harmonization regarding the settings, the occupational biomonitoring levels as well. So I would like to skip on to the next topic. It's focusing on the how to establish OEL values more efficiently, and any kinds of tools or database can contribute to that. So what are some procedures that may help to make establishing OEL values more efficient, such as sharing toxicological and mechanism information and OEL setting methods? So thank you, Claudia. Please start the discussion. Sorry, you muted yourself.
Sorry. I guess it was said now several times, and also perhaps on Friday, but it's the very important thing to be transparent. That means that you should have guidelines in your committee or your regulatory framework, and also to make it transparent. And I think another point is to make it also easily accessible. It means on the website and also in English language. I think not every document is available in English. And also, of course, you should provide the justification for the substance-specific OELs so that others can follow what you decided. And it may be very efficient if you really document, the important details. So I think it was also Andy Meyer who said the systematic review principles should be followed. And the first step is to have a systematic literature research. And I think this would, for example, be a point that you really document the search strings used in the medical databases or toxicological databases, so that the next committee can use it and can just update the search for the new studies. So on the practical side, and I think this is something that would make OEL derivation more efficient if you share your approaches and your decisions.
Yeah, thanks, Claudia, for highlighting many good points. About transparency or easy accessible document or some languages regarding language issues, or some how to make a literature search or something like that. Thank you. And Klaus, please take the floor.
Thank you, Koki. One aspect asked for here in that question is also sharing of toxicological data. So this is certainly an important point. If you start from a different set of data, you might end up with a different value, of course. This can be helped by providing ready available justifications for OELs, where the key studies are clearly described and so on. Also, the ACCA database is certainly a very good step forward there. If the study records submitted with the registration dossiers are detailed enough and of sufficient quality to really be used in the process. So this would really help to provide, let's say, a common starting point for the derivation process.
Yeah, thanks, Klaus. And I think that guiding them to proper or relevant database or qualified database would be a good step for us to help them to find good resources, I think. Yeah, Andy, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I appreciate all the great comments so far. And I agree wholeheartedly that we are making very good progress on harmonization. I'm very excited about it. It's important for all of us. And there again, there's convergence of methods already, which is happening, which is fantastic. With regard to this specific question, one thing I would also notice is one thing that might be helpful was additional sharing of workflows for finding information along the lines of systematic review. There are so many good resources now. We have a lot of sources of information. So the ECHA database is essential. We always look there. The OECD eChem portal is very helpful because it links to a lot of databases very quickly. Another one I would note is the ePace chemistry dashboard is a very helpful resource, especially as we get into the idea of mechanistic information. We're going to be relying on that more and more, and being able to find the mechanistic data through a resource like the EPA chemistry dashboard is another good resource that we use all the time. But again, there's a lot of variation in the workflows among organizations. So I think that this might be a place where, again, international harmonized effort would be very helpful, because I review a lot of different OELs from different groups, and it's not unusual to find recent OELs that even some key studies may not be cited in the other document. And we're at a technology place where that's a solvable problem, I think.
Thanks, Andy. Okay, so any other comment from the panelists? Andrea, please.
Yes, well, I would like to support everything what was said before, and we have to learn, or we have to realize that OELs are always proposed at the current state of knowledge, so it will develop, and therefore it's very important to first of all be very transparent, so everybody can see what has happened, let's say, during the last years, and also that we take into account that the methodology may change. For example, by the report presented by Klaus Schneider from Fobich, we see that, let's say, the intra-individual variability is not an uncertainty, but rather it can be based on data. So, and the same applies also, let's say, to modeling approaches and so on. So this may change the more we know, and therefore you may have some discrepancies, but then you can always come back and see where they are and what they are related to. So I think transparency is really an important point.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. Yes, I agree that transparency is very important, and also we should catch up every time on the latest scientific achievement or advancement. Thanks. Okay, so I would like to switch on to the slide to show the next discussion topic. So that's very important for us, and how to support you further in the context of the OEL harmonizations. So the question is there a role for OECD to play in increasing OEL harmonizations and or efficiently in setting OEL limits within countries? Yeah, in the previous discussion, we have identified some important point to make the OEL settings more efficiently or more transparent, or in a more harmonized manners. So how we could play a role to facilitate these activities. So I would like your kind comments and suggestion and assistance. So Andy, please.
Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to weigh in on this topic. And of course, OECD plays a very important role already. The OECD test methods, which provide standards of quality for the data that we will be using for setting OELs, is an important role already. I mentioned in my talk that we are using the OECD guidance read across framework as part of our process. And again, the WHEEL committee, we're often dealing with chemicals that have a little bit less history and commerce and data. So we use read across quite a bit as one of our tools in our toolkit. 2 suggestions or ideas, unless there may be an activity that I'm not aware of, is again an OEL international OEL portal, I would find very helpful, or collaborating with the Gestus database in some way to make sure that incorporate all expert-based OELs. And the other was, there's definitely room for developing harmonized procedures for OEL methods. For example, the chemical specific adjustment factor method is a very good, robust, detailed guidance that we use in setting OELs. There's many there's guidance on PBPK modeling and how to evaluate those. So we can start to go through the list of methodology questions and develop harmonized guidance around those.
Thank you, Andy, for your very supportive comments, and I'm happy to hear that you have already used our series of guidance document, and I'm happy to help you. And okay, so Klaus, please take the floor.
Thank you. It certainly does not come as a surprise when I tell you that we are living in a globalized world. Chemical companies, larger companies are active in various countries facing different regulations. So at our project workshop earlier this year, company representatives stood up and said, if we are going to go for harmonization, and yes, they are welcoming it, then this should be done on an international level. So ideally, then they would have, let's say, similar workplace regulations everywhere. And I can't really see a better place to try this than OECD. It would not mean that there cannot be parallel activities. So for example, with what we showed with regard to what happens in the EU with different regulatory areas, biocides, pesticides, chemicals, there is also a lot to discuss there, and it can be done in parallel. And both discussions can learn from each other. So, but with an effort to improve transparency and harmonization internationally, please go on.
Yeah, thanks, Klaus. And Claudia, please.
Yes, I think OECD did already a first step with this workshop today, so bringing together people who discuss already harmonization aspects. And I think it might be also an opportunity that OECD would give a recommendation that harmonization is a goal, because that would be the first question, and perhaps one could collect the arguments for harmonization. I think Michelle said that would be a goal to have the same protection level for all workers in different countries. And of course, there are also aspects of resources and efficiency. And another thing is that OECD could be the source for the committees, like collecting the guidance papers and providing them on an accessible website, the guidance papers and also the justification papers. And perhaps even it could be possible to have a platform for providing the current databases for the extrapolation factors. So that the work Phobik and Klaus Schneider did with his team is to collect and to analyze all the NTP and literature data. And so there is now the up-to-date databases, and it could be perhaps provided by OECD and updated. And another point would also be to already try to take also the risk management on board. So people who are the decision makers in the risk management, because if you have to decide on the methods and also the protection levels, as Klaus presented, you have to decide which part of the target population do you want to include in the limit values. And I think it's important to already have the people with you on the way in discussions that have to decide on the protection levels, the risk management level.
Yeah, thank you, Claudio, for your very supportive and good suggestions regarding the next steps, possible next steps for the OECD and in collaboration with you. And I was really interested in collaborating to this develop and maintain the database, and you have the extrapolation factors. Maybe we could discuss further about possible collaborations about that, and also the yeah, I think it's good to identify which guidance document is needed on this topic, and yeah, which guidance document can OECD provide, or something like that. And thank you so much for your great suggestions. And Yvette, please take the floor.
So I echo what Claudia was discussing with respect to risk management. I do think that, you know, there are definitely the potential areas of harmonization, really focusing on some of the development and guidance documents, as well as the information sharing with respect to the methodologies and seeing key things there. I do think that, you know, it's part of our risk management processes. We may have to have certain considerations based on our own statutes, and which I've shared, and which are even different across, you know, EPA, OSHA, NIOSH, and some other regulatory bodies. And so being able to harmonize in areas on methodologies, approaches, and understanding what is the basis, or what is the workflows for what we have to do in terms of our decision making for our occupational exposure limits. I think there's further collaboration there. And so, you know, one of the things is, you know, trying to create more transparency will help us with aligning where we may have some differences in our decision making, as well as more harmonization within that decision making.
Yeah, thank you, Yvette, and particularly on highlighting the importance of the risk management aspects. And yes, the OECD also had a working part on risk management, so we could collaborate with our relevant team to take further about this topic, this discussion topic. And Andy, please.
Yeah, and whether you mentioned risk management, I think one of the questions that was raised in the Q&A panel was about managing a whole landscape of OELs at sort of the site or user of OEL level. And I think this is another opportunity for continued collaboration and harmonization. And that is, you know, the technique that's often applied is hazard and control banding. There's different terminologies for that. So, you know, that's been routinely used in many industries. Actually, some of the foundational work on that was Bruce Naumann's paper on performance-based exposure control limits. And there's, of course, cautious intervals would be another good example. US NIOSH has an exposure banding tool. And then, of course, there's exposure estimation and linked to controls and various other tools like Stoffel Manager and others. So one way to, another thing that might be helpful is, as we're continuing to develop chemical specific OELs, which are still the most prized version of exposure benchmark for occupational risk assessment and management. There are other tools like banding and control banding approaches that there could probably be some value in additional harmonization or discussions about the use of those types of tools. So I'd welcome any other feedback on that from the other panel members as well.
Yeah, thanks, Andy, for your additional comments, and very supportive. And Robots, please take the floor.
Yes, thank you, Koki. I'm coming back to something which was said by Andrea Hartwig, the state of the art in the risk assessment and also in the evaluation of studies is developing. We saw examples from Klaus Schneider dealing with the assessment factors, intra and interspecific. And this could also lead to a role if enough experts coming from different nations would recommend the current state of the art. There would be a possibility for updating national OEL settings or also international OEL setting on ECHA. For example, we had also a collaboration with ECHA in our expert group for following revisions. So I think this is an opportunity also to provide recommendations to the current state of the art as it was seen, as it is seen by the current experts in this field. And this would also allow later harmonization steps in many nations. Also using assessment factors. I think it was shown there are discrepancies also in different EU legislations currently available. Just an idea.
Yeah, thank you, Robert, for sharing very good idea to all. And any other suggestion or comments? Yes, after this workshop, we in Japan and the OECD Secretariat are preparing the workshop report, and your input will be incorporated in the workshop report. Okay, so Klaus, don't hesitate to take the floor if you have any additional suggestion or comments. Yeah, I saw your hands.
Yeah, I saw in the questions section that somebody asked whether it would be just a nice idea to always take the lowest OEL, considering that this is then conservative. This is my interpretation of that question. I would just like to take that up and comment that I don't think that this is the best idea necessarily. If I keep within our ways how we look at this, you could possibly use always the 99th percentile of our distributions and would come up with a very conservative OEL, which is then representing, let's say, a 99.999 safety. But it's always also about being, let's say, spending our efforts in the most efficient way, and this would not necessarily mean this, and therefore, again, it would be the first step to clearly identify what we are aiming at, and then show with a clear documentation whether we achieved it or not. And then somebody else can come and say, okay, I understand it, but I do not agree. I would like to take another path because, and providing justifications. So with such a procedure, we would be able in the end possibly to really exchange opinions on how to derive OELs and come to conclusions.
Yeah, thanks, Klaus. Yes. Okay, again, the objective of the OECD activity is to facilitate countries to for the better policy for the worker protections and in more efficient way in a harmonized manner. So in this context, thank you so much for your great suggestions and input to address further. And your comments will be included in the workshop report. And as Michelle presented, we, the OECD, have several options to contribute to that topics like providing a guidance document and also acting a platform in information sharing among the countries and organizations. And also we could act the platform or work sharing, and including some gathering information and building a database in collaboration with the other organizations and countries. So, okay, and maybe we will develop a report incorporating your comments in terms of this OECD contribution, possible contributions. And Lawrence, thank you for raising your hands, and please take the floor.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe make a specification on semantic here to summarize a bit what was said during these 2 days. I think that we should be clear between the scientific derivation of an OEL and the policy setting of an OEL. And then that encompasses everything that has been said, I think, suggestions, difficulties, lack of harmonization. And indeed there it would be for OECD to decide where to play a role. But at least if the terminology is clear, the same as we were discussing earlier with the difference between assessment factors or uncertainty factors, I think these would be a great benefit for the outcome of this workshop to be clear at least.
Yeah, thanks, Lawrence, for helping me and yeah, to avoid some misunderstanding and confusion. And yeah, we should really important. We should differentiate between the scientific aspects and the policy aspects, and yeah, to think about the topics for thinking about the further harmonizations. And also, yes, I'm sure that it would be a good achievement for us in this discussion to identify the good terminology assessment factors instead of the uncertainty factors. It should be clearly described in the workshop report. Thank you. So any other additional comments? Okay, so if not, I would like to move to the Q&A box. Please open the Q&A box. Thank you so much for all the presenters to kindly respond for most of the questions. Thank you so much. And and some questions for all the speakers. So I would like to take some of them in remaining time. So first is Sherry from Sherry Blistron. Then my question is for answer live. Yes. For any or all of the panelists, what do you consider to be the biggest practical challenge for workplaces required to show compliance with hundreds, if not thousands of OELs? Is having an individual OEL for each chemical in commerce really the best approach to workplace safety? So does anyone can answer this question or no? Share your opinion on that? Okay. Andy, please. Sorry, please unmute yourself.
Thank you. One approach that's been proffered as to get to this idea that we have thousands of chemicals, we have hundreds of thousands of chemicals, or around 100,000, and we have around 10,000 OELs, is the idea of what they call the hierarchy of OELs. So you have different types of. It's important for people to have benchmarks to guide the control and exposure management strategies. And so as we're developing or improving and increasing the landscape of occupational exposure limits, this is the opportunity to keep moving it down that path, but also link those with common control strategies for ranges of OEL potency. And that's the comment I was making about exposure hazard bands and control bands, which it's a common technique if you're handling lots of different chemicals, many of which will have no OELs, but still ensuring that there's a benchmark and a level of control associated with the range of OELs that one might anticipate. So there's techniques in that light that have been developed and are continuing to be developed.
Thanks, Sandy, for answering the question. And also, Andrea, please.
Well, the first answer would be, in most workplaces, you don't have these hundreds or thousands of substances. You have maybe 1 or 2 critical, or maybe 5. And therefore, these OELs are very important. But I would like to emphasize that setting OELs is only one measure to control workplace air. So in addition, it needs to be recognized that the air at the workplace should be as protective as possible, especially if you work, for example, with carcinogens. You always are obliged to decrease the level as low as possible. So I think we still have some kind of minimization, but still some OELs for the upper limit or whatsoever, which should be controlled. So I think setting these OELs will also contribute to get the workplaces cleaner in general, without having to comply with thousands of OELs. So I think it's just one measure, but an important step to control the quality of the workplaces and the health aspects of the workplaces. Thanks,
Andrea. Okay, so done the question. Okay, the next one is more a little bit technical one. From anonymous attendees, aspiration bioavailability is difficult to identify. How should aspiration bioavailability be considered when setting the OEL? I think the bioavailability due to suction depends on the size distribution of the airborne particles. Even if the OEL is set, how to measure the airborne exposure is also important. Is there such a discussion? So anyone can help to answer the questions? Okay, yes, thanks, Andy. So Andy first, and next Lawrence, please.
Yeah, I appreciate the question, because this is one of those areas I mentioned that it's definitely, there are techniques and tools and it's evolving. I actually put in the Q&A feature a response to a question about inhalation dosimetry. And so there's certainly some good guidance regarding that topic, including ECHA has guidance. I think maybe Lawrence will talk about that. But I put a paper that would be a good start. And yeah, and there's also a lot of work going on the measurement side, as was mentioned here, about particle size selective measurement techniques, and those are continuing to improve and evolve as well. So I think we are, getting much more sophisticated in our ability to set OELs based on size selectivity, and set OELs based on where the deposited dose using inhalation dosimetry tools. So those things are happening.
Thanks, Andy. So Lawrence, next, please.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's part of the downstream effect, so to speak, of an OEL being set, that there is a monitoring obligation from the employer to ensure, as Andrea was saying earlier, the air quality when processing these substances. So it is, at least in Europe, it is part of the OEL setting, for that matter, after ECHA has provided the scientific recommendation, where, as I was presenting in my presentation, this is part of the assessments that we do during the derivation of the OEL. Thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence. And also Andrea, please.
Well, I think what we didn't discuss this much would be biological monitoring. So I think we should, somehow think and discuss in both terms of air monitoring, but also biological monitoring. And within biological monitoring, you can see what really comes into the body and what effects are mediated by these internal concentrations. So I think it's very important always to investigate whether it's possible to also identify a biological limit value or biological guidance value. And this would give you some idea, or a very good idea, what's really taken up in spite of this diversity for aspiration and so on.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. Yeah, the OECD has recently published, will publish a guidance document on the on setting the occupational biomonitoring values. So it may help you some of it. Thanks. Okay, so the last one is to all. Is it factored into consider the OECD mutual acceptance of data and COCAP, Cooperative Chemicals Assessment Program, in deriving health-based OELs? Yeah, it's about kind of the OECD other programs. So I would say first that in my understanding, currently there are no ambitions to connect to the other OECD's framework. So sorry, we have planned anything about that. But just I think it could be an idea to do further for the OECD. So if anyone like to make a comment on that, or any suggestion regarding this these ideas, or from the other panelists, I would appreciate if you could have some opinion or like this. No? Okay, thank you so much for cooperating to answer all the questions. Okay, yes, so now is the time to move on to the last item for next topic. So thank you so much for you really fruitful discussion and very good suggestions for the panel discussion session. Thank you so much. And I would like to share my screen about the next steps, possible next steps, including, okay. Yes, and after this workshop, Japan, NIOSH, and the OECD will draft the workshop report, and based on the two-day discussions and reflecting your fruitful input into each chapters, I would show you the table of contents, and after the introductions, at first, we will focus on the approach to set OEL values, mostly discussed in the day one, to develop a general workflow and processes, and divided three main steps: definitions and scope of values, and how data evaluate to support and develop OELs, and methodology for deriving OELs. As a panelist, have already seen the draft version of that in a secretary note, and so your input will be incorporated into each parts. And also we have a chapter on focusing on the endpoints, specific endpoint and the methodologies like carcinogenicity, skin sensitizer, and biomonitoring. And then section 3, a future perspective, exploring international harmonization on OEL settings. It's based on today's discussions, and we will summarize the current status of harmonization and the harmonization practice around the world that is provided from all the speakers today. And then we will explore more harmonized and efficient approach in establishing OELs. Yeah, some possible options and ideas are provided by the experts today. So I will summarize your input into these sections. And also, we'll move on to the potential activities for harmonizations and possible contribution by the OECD, like providing a guidance document or facilitates the information sharing, and even the work sharing could be facilitated by us, and policy alignment would be a more challenging section, but we could make partly a little bit about that also. And so the timeline is that the workshop report is expected to be published by Q1 2023. That was my ambitions, and I would appreciate all the presenter and panelists if you could do a kind of review on the draft documents to be prepared maybe by the end of this year. And hopefully the next follow-up activity is to be launched by reflecting the workshop discussions after the publication of the workshop report. And please note that the OECD work is voluntary based. So any follow-up project proposal from the Working Party delegates are really welcome. And thank you so much for your active participation, continuous active participation on these topics. So that's all for today. I would like to go to the closing remarks sections, and please remind us that this workshop is hosted by the Japan NIOSH. So I would invite Mariko Ono to make a warmest closing remark. Hi, Mariko. I hope this workshop is really helpful to you in setting your own OELs values in a more harmonized manner.
Yes, but it's unclear how we go. So may I thank to everyone? It's okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to the speakers and the participants of the 2-day 6-hour workshop. Extensive ideas for setting OELs and harmonization were very suggestive and shed light on the path we should take. Even though the road ahead is Japan is still unclear. It's hard. I don't have any concrete ideas still now. Anyway, we should proceed with OEL setting work while referring to the information we received this time. Thank you again, all of you, for your supportive discussion. And thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Mariko, and yeah, thank you. And I'm looking forward to the further collaboration with you in harmonizing the OEL settings. And also thank you so much for all the presenters and the panelists for your great contribution to the discussion. And yes, and I'm looking forward to also the further collaboration with you in exploring further this topic. And so, thank you for all the audience for taking the time to attend this workshop. And please participate in the satisfaction survey and to provide your feedback to the workshop, and that would be really helpful for us to improve our programs to support the developing and improving your policy on the occupational health field. So and thank you so much for participation. So I'm now closing the workshop. So have a good day and have a good week. So thank you. So bye.